Good morning. How's everyone? Good, good. Okay, so I will, just for the sake of time, not take too much time and kind of pivot to our panelists to get us started with a couple of presentations, and just a reminder that we hope that it's an engaging conversation after these presentations. So as you're thinking of questions, please use the Slido tool to pop your questions in, and we look forward to the conversation today. And so just to get us started with the first presentation, we have Elaine, who would like to go first. Okay.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So thanks so much for having me. So I'm a PhD student with Dr. Laura Perna at Penn, and since about 2015, we have done a lot of work to try to understand the landscape of college promise programs, really the variations.
How these?
Oh, sorry. How these? Oh, yes. Thank you. Okay, I'll stand here then. Sorry about that. So my name is Elaine Leigh. I'm a PhD student with Dr. Laura Perna, and we've done a lot of work since 2015 trying to understand the landscape of college promise programs, really how they vary across the country. So this talk is going to be focused not only on giving everyone sort of a lay of the land, what do we understand about promise programs from research, what's some common terminology to make sure that we are all kind of talking the same language about these programs, just to give everyone the same foundation. So, as most of you know, promise programs are being created as we speak and have been for about 10 plus years in many different cities across the U.S., in urban regions, rural regions, really you name it. This movement is really expanding, and not only at the local level, but also nearly half of states have some type of free college program. Normally at the state level, states are promising free community college, so up to 2 years of tuition free. But you can see again that this trend is increasing across the nation. But what in our work, looking at the local programs and the state programs that are across the nation, we know that they're designed in very different ways. They're serving different students. So we really need a common definition of what do we mean by a college promise program. And in our work, we use a three-pronged definition. First, these programs all have a central goal of increasing higher education attainment in the places that they're being started in or in their states. Also, these programs have some sort of financial component, financial award attached to them, beyond existing federal aid and state aid dollars. And the federal aid dollars we're most referring to are Pell Grant dollars that are available for low-income students. So all these programs have some sort of financial incentive. And the key thing with the College Promise movement is also that all these programs have some sort of place-based eligibility criteria. So they're recognizing and wanting to serve students who are maybe living in a certain city or a certain county or attending a certain school district for these to be eligible for these programs in lieu of or sometimes in addition to other sorts of academic or income requirements. So these are really the three key components, the place-based component really being a central part of this College Promise movement. So in our work and in others, there's been efforts to try to organize and understand these different initiatives. So if you want to be able to search all the different kinds of programs that we've collected and organized information on, I would point you to Penn Ahead's searchable database on programs where we include local and state programs. The Upjohn Institute, that does most of the work on the Kalamazoo Promise, also has a searchable database, and they focus more on local programs that have some sort of early targeting component that look much like the Kalamazoo Promise. And then I'll just point to a state resource. So California is the state with the most College Promise programs right now, many at single community colleges. And so the team at WestEd, along with other colleagues, have developed this website as a resource on just California state programs as well. And so, again, just to make sure that we are all coming from a common foundation, I want to discuss a few main dimensions that we know that these programs vary across when we look at the number and different types of programs. So often these programs are varying on what they're requiring of students to be eligible for the program, how they're dispensing a financial award, where students can use those programs, so the kinds of institutions and the restrictions on college choice that might be involved in setting up these programs, and whether these programs are targeting students earlier in their high school career or not. So starting with eligibility requirements, you'll often hear programs requiring students to meet at least some combination of these characteristics. So sometimes programs are merit-based and may have some sort of academic criterion that students have to meet, usually with a GPA cutoff, which you can imagine would limit the pool of students. If you have something like a 3.0 cutoff versus a 2.5 cutoff, you're targeting different kinds of students in the program if you have a merit-based component. Then you have programs that may institute a need-based requirement. So usually they are instituting some kind of income cutoff, or at least generally saying they want to serve students with demonstrating some sort of financial need. And of course, then you have programs that have a hybrid. They may have merit-based and need-based requirements to be eligible for their program. Often what's considered the most kind of generous program, or the one that's going to be simplest and clear-cut to students, are universal eligibility programs. So these are different in that they're not requiring students to meet certain academic requirements or certain income requirements. They're essentially saying any student that lives in a certain city or goes to a certain school district can get this award. And so you can imagine that that's pretty clear to families. Hey, I'm graduating from Pittsburgh Public Schools. I can receive this award. That's all you have to do. So there's a bucket of programs that fit that universal category. Another key distinction that needs to be understood in understanding the design and implications of college promise programs is how financial awards are determined. So you will often hear this is a first dollar program versus a last dollar program. And what really is meant by that is a first dollar program, that financial award is awarded to the student first, before considering any other federal aid that they might receive or any other state aid. So let's say a student grows up in a certain county and that county is promising all kids get $1,000 when they graduate, and it's a first dollar award. That student is guaranteed that $1,000. They could use it potentially for any costs of college and have their other tuition covered by other Pell dollars if they're eligible, or other state aid. On the flip side, last dollar programs are the most common type of design of college promise programs, mostly due to cost constraints, resource constraints in different communities. And what happens with last dollar programs is that amount of the financial award is calculated after considering the kinds of federal and state aid that a student will receive. So theoretically, a student might be eligible for a partial Pell Grant. They might get some state aid and have maybe $100 left over that needs to be covered for tuition. That last dollar program would be promising, hey, we'll cover that $100. And if you think about it, some students already get all their tuition covered. If you get like a full Pell Grant and you're going to a community college, that's $6,000+. Technically, in a last dollar program, a low-income student who receives full Pell funding may not be a beneficiary of that last dollar program because their tuition has been covered. So there's different trade-offs and constraints in trying to understand these two different models. Not finally, but programs also vary on where students can use their funds. So the most common type of program now cropping up are programs just at one community college. And so you'll see community college only programs. They're promising institutional aid just to attend their institution. And you also see this a little bit at the four-year level, but it's much more common at the community college level. The Rutgers-Camden program is an example of a four-year only type of program. Then, of course, you have programs that are giving a broader set of college choices to students and saying, you can use this award at any 2-year or 4-year college of your choice, but they usually bound that within the state that the student is residing in. And there's a handful of programs that do fit that model as well. And then very rarely, but you do see it if you are looking at across the expanse of programs. There are some programs that say, hey, there's no restrictions on your college choices. You can go to any college across the country. You're not limited to the state bounds. And so all these different kinds of rules within the program have implications for where students can attend, right, and the kinds of choices that are available to them. And finally, programs really benefit or vary on where the program benefits begin, when they begin. So you have a chunk of programs that tend to be early targeting or what we call early awareness type of programs. And so this means that there might be some actually tangible supports built into those programs before the student graduates college, maybe in the form of college counseling in middle school and high school if the program has those sorts of resources. More often, early awareness can also mean that the financial award is somehow tied to how long a student is living in a certain area. So if it's an early awareness program, you might get more of that financial award if you have lived in that place since kindergarten versus if you just moved there in high school. And it's a way to incentivize staying or moving into a certain place that has these programs. More often than not, though, at least the trend that we're seeing now, especially with community college type programs, is that these programs are built for high school graduates enrolling directly that fall semester. And so most programs tend to fit this category where it's specifically for that graduating senior and they have to enroll in the fall. But there's more talk and I think more push to have programs that are now offering post-high school, so allowing adults, students that maybe took a break for a year or two, or even more than that, to be eligible for programs. And you're starting to see that trend, or I think people want to see that the movement go in that direction. But there are a few programs that offer the benefit to post-high school grads as well. So given all that variation, I want to very briefly at a very high level go over, well, what do we actually know from research on how college promise programs work? And so there is a building amount of evidence, and researchers tend to look at these things from K-12 outcomes, post-secondary outcomes, and then kind of community and economic development outcomes. But the key caveat to what I'll summarize for you is that a lot of the published research out there is based on just a handful of programs. And we know this movement is growing every day, and there's at least 140, 150 local programs, if not with state programs as well. But a lot of our research is focused on these programs that are listed here that tend to be those early awareness types of programs. They tend to give a broader choice set to students, larger financial awards. Some of them are first dollar programs as well. So it's a very specifically designed type of program that we have evidence on. And you'll learn a little bit more about that with our later panelists. But there's less research done on what's becoming the most common model, the community college only model, one institution starting a promise program at their community college, and even less on four-year programs like the Rutgers-Camden that we'll hear about. So in this table, what I've basically done here, if we look at what do we know from research on K-12 outcomes, you can see, the types of outcomes researchers are interested in. Does the introduction of a promise program in a community raise things like students' high school GPA now that they know that that award is available? Does it raise math and reading scores or potentially high school graduation rates? The plus and minus signs kind of give you a general idea of the direction of effects that are seen in those papers, and then the orange boxes are statistically significant effects that are found in those papers. And what you can see is, at least looking at one program at a time, there may be some positive effects at the K-12 level, but you can see that studying these effects across multiple kinds of programs and multiple cities and multiple contexts, we just don't have a lot of that information. So it's hard to straight out say all promise programs will have these sorts of effects. But again, you can see some of the trending evidence at the K-12 level. I would say that we're starting to see in the research a more robust finding around college enrollment. So you can see across 4 programs that have been assessed on different post-secondary outcomes related to enrollment, persistence, and completion in college. We do see a consistent finding in the literature and statistically significant findings around college enrollment. These programs seem to help increase enrollment in their communities. We don't know quite as much around, how these programs affect persistence, and really less on completion. We know a little bit more about Kalamazoo because it's been around since 2006, so there's been more time to study those effects. But a lot of the research is constrained because a lot of these programs are pretty new, and so students may be just going into college. We haven't seen how far they've completed their paths. And finally, researchers are really interested as well in, well, what actually happens in a community, in a place that's thinking about or instituting a college promise program. And so a lot of communities that are interested in this are also interested in revitalization of their economies, of bringing back people because they've been suffering from depopulation. And so researchers are trying to understand, well, does a promise program help bring more people back through mobility rates? Or we can look at population growth through public school enrollments. And you can see, again, across the different kinds of programs, there's some promising trends around raising population as measured by public school enrollment, a little bit mixed evidence on housing values, and this is all very contextual, but it gives you an idea of what's being studied out there and generally what's starting to be found. So to close, I really just wanted to pose a few critical questions that I think should be in our minds as we continue the conversation throughout the day about the potential of college promise programs to do many different things around affordability issues, completion issues, community revitalization issues. And so the first set are really around college access. If we want these programs to succeed, we need to first understand, well, how are students and families even learning about these programs? How is this being messaged to the community? And is it being messaged in really equitable ways? You also need to think about if you're designing programs or want to fund or start these programs, what do students have to do to be eligible? How many hoops do they have to jump through? And when does that become a barrier to more students receiving the benefit of this promise? Evaluations also need to be done on which students will most likely be the recipients of those programs in a community as well. If we want to tackle affordability issues, we also need to understand, well, if it's a first dollar or last dollar program, how much can we actually afford to cover for each student? What is that financial award going to cover? What's not going to be covered? Is that going to be really helpful for our goals or not? Certainly there's other costs and benefits that have to be thought about, but that's a key question around affordability. Around completion, if we want these programs to also facilitate college completion, we need to think about, well, where can students use these awards? There's some concern out there that, with the widespread amount of community college awards, is that changing students' college choices who would have otherwise gone to a four-year college, going to a community college, right? That's an active question out there. But there's also benefits to just having a widespread message that you can go to college and this is available. But where students are constrained choice-wise is important to consider, as well as what other supports are there in the programs. Is it just a financial benefit, or are there other things that the institutions or the community is doing to facilitate students understanding all the different requirements that are needed to go to college and complete college? And finally, I think the big question in our head is sustainability. In the communities, in the states that these programs are starting in, how politically and financially sustainable are these programs in the long run? We don't want to start a program in a community where you can't keep that promise. So how do we actually make this work for so many different kinds of communities facing so many kinds of needs? So with that, I'll leave it to the next panels. Thanks.
Oh, what did I do? Shoot. I think I have advanced it to the end. Thank you. So hi all, can everyone hear me? Good, okay, great. So my name is Meredith Billings. I am a postdoc at the University of Georgia. Thank you, Elaine, for that great overview of Promise programs. So right now I'm going to narrow it down to look at one state of Promise programs. So there's about 20 different Promise programs in Michigan. I am going to talk about 9 out of those 20 or so programs. One of those programs is the Kalamazoo Promise, which we've been hearing about a lot, and I'm sure you're probably fairly familiar with. The other set of programs are the Promise Zones, and they are different from the Kalamazoo Promise in that they were designated by the state, and they have very different design elements compared to the Kalamazoo Promise. If you are familiar with Michigan, I took some liberties about where the stars are. So trying to be more like stylistic so you can see it. But okay. So like I said, the Kalamazoo Promise, it started in November of 2005. There was a group of anonymous donors that pledged up to 100% of tuition and fees all the way up to a bachelor's degree. This got wide attention across the nation. There was a media frenzy. So the idea of Promise programs and free college kind of spread across the nation, and that led to this like huge Promise program movement. The Michigan Promise Zones were inspired by the Kalamazoo Promise. They were created, though, by a state legislation in January of 2009, and they were targeted towards economically distressed areas. So the areas actually had to apply to the state. So 15 applied and 10 received Promise Zone designation. And so I am going to talk about 8 out of these 10, and that's because they started awarding the scholarships from about 2010 to 2013. And the other thing that's different about the Promise Zones, when it comes to funding, there's a mix of private and public funding, which I'm not going to talk about now, but I'm happy to talk about during the discussion if you have questions about what that looks like. So just to give you like a general picture of trying to understand what the designs of the Kalamazoo Promise compared to the Michigan Promise Zones. So they are universal in the sense that it's only resident criteria. So you have to live within either the Kalamazoo public school system, or you have to live within the boundaries of the Promise Zones. And depending upon where you enter or when you enter the public school system is what % of the scholarship that you're eligible for. The Promise Zones, the 10 of them, there's a lot of different variation within each of the Promise Zones because they looked at the state legislation and then they created their own eligibility criteria depending upon their local context and their goals. I try to distill down to it kind of like the main points, but I'd be happy to talk about more about what that variation is and what that looks like. The main thing to understand between the Kalamazoo Promise and the Promise Zones are that the Kalamazoo Promise is up to a bachelor's degree, while the Promise Zones are really only focused on the associate's degree level. The Kalamazoo Promise is a first dollar scholarship. So students who are eligible for need-based aid are going to get more aid than they would have gotten otherwise without the scholarship, where the Promise Zones are a last dollar scholarship. So talking with people in the Promise Zone, since a lot of their students are eligible for the Pell Grant, sometimes they think of the Promise Zones more as an informational wrapper because students are not getting more money than they would have otherwise gotten. It kind of helps distill information about how to apply to college so in a simpler package than they might have otherwise have gotten. And then the big difference is the Kalamazoo Promise. They can go to any Michigan public college or university. And then starting with the class of 2015, they also can go to some of the Michigan private institutions. For the Promise Zones, though, usually it's focused at the local community college, and some of them expand to other options. But what they do is like they cap it at whatever the local community college tuition rate is. So you might be able to go to a four-year institution, but you're only going to get the tuition rate or the amount of money up to what you would have received at a community college. So you could think about that might only be like $2,000 or $3,000 for a scholarship. So I'm just going to talk about a little bit about my research, about what I am seeing for some of the effects of the eligibility. So I was looking at what is the effect of students being eligible for these programs. So for the Kalamazoo, I just wanted to show you the outcomes for college enrollment and degree completion. The other major critique of the Promise programs is that students who are more advantaged within the school districts are the ones that are able to benefit from these scholarships. So I wanted to show you some student subgroup analysis compared to the Kalamazoo Promise. For the Michigan Promise Zones, I'm going to show you college enrollment. They haven't really been around long enough to show you degree completion. So what I'm going to do is show you persistence to the second year of college. So my research design for both of these programs is I'm comparing students in either Kalamazoo or the Michigan Promise Zones before and after the program started awarding scholarships. And then I'm looking at a set of poor urban school districts from across the state that are similar either to the Kalamazoo school district or similar to the Promise Zone school districts. And then I'm again looking before and after they started awarding scholarships. So right here, I'm showing you Kalamazoo in red, and I compare them to 7 poor urban school districts from across the state. For the Michigan Promise Zones, there's 8 of them, also in red, and I'm comparing them to 13 poor urban school districts from across the state. So the great thing about these designs is that you can graph them. So for the Kalamazoo, what you're seeing along the horizontal axis is the cohorts. So to the left of the red line, you're seeing the pre-promise cohorts. So those are the students that graduated high school and the Kalamazoo Promise had not existed yet. And then you'll see students, so to the right of the red line is the what we call the post-promise cohorts. So those are the students that graduated from high school and the Promise program was awarding scholarships. So this is showing you kind of the mean college enrollment over time for the Kalamazoo public school system students. They're in the gray diamond, and then the poor urban school districts are in the black circle. So with this design, what we see is there's about a 10 percentage point increase in college enrollment for students that are eligible for the Kalamazoo Promise. If we look to the Promise Zones and look at enrollment in college, so the x-axis looks a little, that's the horizontal axis, looks a little bit different because the Promise Zones started in several different years. So what you're seeing, that red line is showing you, so I had to like collapse them all together. So you're not seeing specific years, but what you are seeing is the year before the scholarship got started and the years after the scholarships got started. So in this case, I'm also still looking at the mean college enrollment within 1 year of expected high school graduation. So we are seeing a positive point estimate of 4.5 percentage point increase. Unfortunately, the estimate is fairly noisy. So what that means is because what we would say the range around this point estimate is so large, I'm not able to say that it's statistically significant from zero. I also wanted to show you degree completion and persistence. So for the Kalamazoo Promise for degree completion, and in this time, if you look across the x-axis, what you'll see or what you'll notice is one of several of the cohorts kind of dropped out. And this is because I'm looking within 6 years of their expected high school graduation to see whether they had a degree. And we just don't have information. I think a lot of this is kind of a time crunch where you have to kind of wait until cohorts of students kind of move through the system to be able to really evaluate some of these longer term effects. So for degree completion, I'm only seeing 3 cohorts of students. And if you remember, just to let you know that these 3 cohorts were in high school when the Kalamazoo Promise was announced. And so we can also talk about there's some like short-term effects and some longer-term effects about thinking about the theory of change in these school districts and in these places. And so if you're in high school when a Promise program is announced, that's probably going to look really different about some of the behaviors that you would do as opposed to if you were in middle school when the Promise program is announced. However, for degree completion, I am still seeing some positive effects. So there's a 5 percentage point increase for students that were eligible for the Kalamazoo Promise. If we look over to the Promise zones for persistence to the second year of college, I'm also seeing another positive point estimate, about a 3.5 percentage point increase for students that are eligible for the Promise Zone scholarships. However, similarly to the enrollment estimates, they're just very large. Confidence intervals, what we think of like the range around that point estimate. So I can't say it's like statistically different from zero. And then I think one of the main interesting results about the Kalamazoo Promise and some of the things that, with research and as we're designing programs that we really need to think about, like who is benefiting from these scholarship programs. So what I did for the Kalamazoo Promise is I compared white and Asian students to Black and Latino students, as well as students that were economically disadvantaged in 8th grade compared to not economically disadvantaged. All that really means is whether they were eligible for free and reduced price lunch in 8th grade. And so if you look across that row for enrolling in any college within 1 year of expected high school graduation, so you're seeing like very strong positive effects for across the student subgroups for enrolling in college. I think what we need to think about as a group when you go down and look at earning any degree within 6 years of expected high school graduation, that's where you really start to see differences between the student subgroups. So you'll see white and Asian students, as well as those that are not economically disadvantaged, have fairly strong positive effects on degree completion. However, Black and Latino, as well as those that are economically disadvantaged, either have negative or kind of very modest positive effects. And since they're not statistically significant, what that is also telling us is they're not really doing any better than the students in that poor urban school districts, those comparison school districts. And I'm happy to talk more about why I think this is going on during the discussion. Just to give you some wrap up and some main takeaways and some next steps. So we do see that there are some strong positive effects for the Kalamazoo Promise. However, Black, Latino, and poor students are not experiencing those same strong positive effects on degree completion as their white, Asian, and non-poor counterparts. You should, though, remember that these are the three cohorts of students that were in high school when the Kalamazoo Promise was announced. So hopefully when we think about theories of change and as more students coming through the pipeline, that we would like to see that narrow and not to be such a stark difference. Some of the next steps, though, as we can think about as a group, if some students are not getting their degrees, we need to figure out why is that so? So we could look at what kind of courses are they taking when they get to college? Do they need to take a lot of remedial courses? Is that what's going on about why they're not getting their degree? What type of institutions are these students attending? And are they remaining eligible for the scholarship for year to year? For the main takeaways and next steps for the Michigan Promise Zones, unfortunately, what I can say is there are positive point estimates, so that's good. However, they're just not estimated precisely enough that you really want to hang your hat on at this point in time. So what could happen is more cohorts to go through, doing some more evaluation and analysis of those programs. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be positive point estimates at the end of the day, but hopefully they will be estimated precisely enough to see that there is a statistically significant effect or not. Some of the next steps for the promise zones is thinking about if they're just this informational wrapper and it's really not about the scholarship, how can they kind of leverage their community resources? When are students being made aware of the scholarship? And then also thinking about the promise zones in general. If you think back to that design slide that I was talking about, they were really set up for really large impacts like the Kalamazoo Promise was. So with that, I will conclude and thank you so much and happy to talk more about this at the break or during the discussion.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Alyssa Rutledge, and I am a research analyst at MDRC. For those of you who are not familiar with MDRC, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization, and we do a lot of rigorous evaluations, such as randomized controlled trials and quasi-experimental evaluations of social programs in a number of fields: welfare, housing, prison anti-recidivism, early childhood education, K-12 education, and my department focuses on post-secondary education, with a particular focus on the types of institutions that serve our country's historically underrepresented and currently disadvantaged populations. So that's community colleges, technical colleges, HBCUs, really those colleges who are disproportionately serving that population. So we at MDRC think a lot about promise programs, really thinking about some of the concerns that Elaine, Meredith, and others have raised around things like equity, thinking about who they're serving, how they're structured, how they can be designed better, and also how they can serve the dual goals of access and success. So promise programs traditionally really focused on college access. How can we get more students into college, which is a fantastic goal, a really laudable goal. We know that we need more students to enter college. But if those programs are not also helping students be successful once they're there, we're not really getting to the program's goal of getting students to graduation, getting them to a family-sustaining wage, right? The goal of a program is never to get a student to step foot in the college in September after they graduate from high school. The goal is to get them graduated into a career with a family-sustaining wage. And when we look at the data about how students are doing in college, we really focus our efforts on the success side. And I'll give you an example of why. So these data are pulled from the 2016 publication from the Department of Ed, and look at students who start at public two-year institutions. So that's essentially community and technical colleges. You'll see that 3 years after matriculating, so that's 150% of the typical time to an associate's degree, only 14% of students have graduated. 44% are still enrolled or may have transferred to another college. So that can be good or bad. It could mean they're just taking extra time. It could mean they've transferred to a 4-year and they're looking at a baccalaureate degree, which is great. But 42% are not enrolled anywhere. And that's really staggering. 42% are not enrolled anywhere and have no degree. So we've identified, and the research literature has identified, several different problems that cause this. These might be academic challenges, as Meredith mentioned. A lot of students, especially who are coming from low-income areas of the country, have to complete remedial courses once they've enrolled. There are financial barriers, which Promise programs take a look at, although students may face other issues such as the cost of books, transportation, the opportunity cost of being in college instead of working full-time. Students struggling with a work-life school balance, especially for students who are parents themselves or responsible for taking care of family members. A lack of college know-how, which is especially pronounced for first-generation students. You'll see in our work later, we do a lot of work with first-generation students, and a lot of them really have no idea what to do once they get on campus and don't have anyone in their immediate family that they can turn to for advice. And then finally, a lot of students face institutional barriers. For those of you who are familiar with the guided pathways model, this is really speaking to that. You know, students might need to take courses for their major that are not offered every semester. How are they going to handle that? Well, all of a sudden they're at a semester, they have no classes to take. So, like I mentioned earlier, we really think about the dual goals of both access to college and success once they're there. And we've been working with a number of College Promise programs across the country to build programs that do both of those things. So we've worked with a number of different Promise programs across the country. They're listed here. And these are programs who have a Promise scholarship in place, but really are not seeing the kinds of completion rates that they wanted to be seeing. And we started working together with the goal of developing additional supports or changing their program design or making changes that really would support students to not only arrive in college, but persist and eventually get to a credential. I'm going to focus today mostly on the Detroit Promise path, and the reason is that we have done a randomized control trial to evaluate the new program. But what I'm going to talk about, I think, is broadly applicable across all of those Promise programs that I mentioned earlier, and happy to talk more about the details when we get to the discussion portion. So the Detroit Promise is a pretty typical College Promise program in that it offers students a last dollar tuition and fee scholarship for students who are from the city of Detroit, graduate from a Detroit high school, and then enter one of 5 area community colleges. So the community college district that's in the city of Detroit, as well as 4 others in the suburbs and surrounding areas. The program has since expanded to a couple of 4-year universities, but for our study, we looked just at community college students. So the scholarship had been around for several years, and the Detroit Regional Chamber, who administers the program, observed that more students seemed to be coming from high school into college, but less than half of students were still enrolled in school as of their second year. So the numbers were just a staggering drop between the first year and the second year. And they said, we hear from students that they're facing a lot of these issues. This is a predominantly low income, predominantly first generation population. They don't know what to do on campus. Almost all of our students are working. They often are not getting support at home or in the community for taking time in college instead of working. So we want to do some additional work to help support these students. So we partnered with the Detroit Promise Path to design some additional program components based on the research literature of what works for this particular population of students. The biggest piece is that we created campus coach positions. So these are distinct from academic advisors. They take more of a holistic view on how a student is doing, what other responsibilities that student faces outside of school, how they can be successful within the school. So a common exercise they'll do with students is, how do you talk to a faculty member at office hours? Something I think many of us were intimidated by, thinking back to our freshman year of college. But for these students, it can be especially problematic because they don't really know anyone on campus. They don't know who to talk to in their family about this. Many of them are coming from predominantly Black high schools and going into predominantly white colleges, facing stereotype threat. So really helping students with all of those different things. Some of them may also be as simple as, I know that you need to go talk to an academic advisor. I'm going to walk you over there to dispel some of this stigma, get students to actually act on it. So really providing those additional supports that traditionally college campuses do not provide. Students who participate in the program and meet with their coach as directed twice per month are eligible to get $50 a month. This is a pretty typical behavioral science paid financial incentive. We hear from students that they mostly spend it on transportation and food. So that gives you a sense of what kind of population of students we're working with, that one of the big things that they're facing on campus is food insecurity. In addition, students continue to be engaged by the program throughout the summer. So they're either offered summer classes paid for by the program, connecting them to local summer jobs program, and their coaches continue to reach out to them. So really figuring out, okay, if you've completed 2 semesters, we don't want you to disappear over the summer. We want you to be engaged in something productive. And finally, the program uses a management information system to keep track of student participation. So this means both saying, okay, who have I seen this month, but also, who have I not seen? Who have I not heard from? I want to send a text message to all the students who haven't registered for next semester or who haven't completed their FAFSA yet, really continuing to meet students where they are and help support them along the way. So our randomized control trial took a look at students in fall 2016 and fall 2017. Random assignment was used because the program did not have enough funding to offer spots to all students. So using a lottery essentially is a fair way to give those spots out, not just giving them to the students who first show up, first come, first serve, but also students who show up the day before school starts who arguably need that help even more. And as a note, our study is comparing the new program to the scholarship alone. So control group students continue to receive the Detroit Promise Scholarship. This is a test just of these additional supports. You can see that this is a very high poverty population. We look at things like free and reduced price lunch, which is very high, Pell Grant receipt, which is very high. About 75 to 80% of students identify as first generation, don't live with a parent who's earned a bachelor's degree. It is a predominantly female population. Most of the students are coming right out of high school, and the vast majority of our students identify as students of color. So I'll give you a chance to check these graphs out. So the program group, so that's our group receiving the Detroit Promise Path, the additional supports. Those are the dark blue bars. The lighter blue bars are the control group. So that's students who are still able to receive the scholarship offer, but are not getting any of that outreach from the coach. And you can see that we see pretty large and statistically significant impacts on enrollment rates. In fact, these second semester enrollment rates are among the highest that we at MDRC have seen in randomized control trials. So you're really seeing that the program is keeping more students in school, and it's also keeping them enrolled full-time. Full-time enrollment is important because it correlates with students' likelihood of persisting and getting to a degree. And what's interesting about this is that the program nominally requires students to enroll full-time, although students aren't really penalized if they drop below full-time status. So what you can see is if students are given that direction, they're not able to do it, this program is helping more of those students stay in school full-time. Okay. You'll also see that we have a very large impact on summer enrollment, almost tripling the number of students who enroll in school in the summer, which is really encouraging because there is burgeoning research literature around summer enrollment, academic momentum, keeping students up. It's also a way for students to complete remedial courses in a non-fall spring semester to get those out of the way. So this is really encouraging. Finally, we see that in their first year, students are twice as likely to complete a full-time course load. So if you think back, the program nominally requires students to enroll full-time, and you can see that there are really large impacts here on students' likelihood of doing that. And related, a much lower number of students received 0 credits. Qualitatively, we hear from students that they really value the program, that it's something that really matters to them. In particular, the coaching component, helping them out with that coaching, that advice, someone to go to on campus is extremely beneficial. In a survey, we found that students were more likely to report that they understood college processes, which for a first-generation population is pivotal for their success. We, however, did find that students continued to have a lot of financial challenges, and when it came down to why students were no longer enrolled in school, by far the most common reason was that they faced financial issues. Almost all of our students said that they need to work to support themselves and their families. Many students reported that they had experienced food or housing insecurity along the way. And again, many of these students said that when it came to issues like food and housing insecurity, they simply could not justify staying in college when they needed to work to support their families. So we really see this as a way that there's a lot more work to do in supporting these students, but it's something that we want to continue to do. So we'll get into the conversation in a minute, but there's a couple things I want to flag for everyone coming out of both Detroit and the other College Promise Success Initiative programs that we've worked with. So one harkens back to what my co-presenters have said. Program design really matters. If you think about how to get students to enroll full-time or enroll part-time, for state programs, we are seeing a lot of shuffling of students. And one thing you want to think about if you are offering a program is, are you incentivizing students who would have gone to a 4-year to go to a 2-year instead? And, how does college matching play into the incentives that you're creating? Meredith alluded to this earlier, but one of the critiques of College Promise programs is that for some students, especially higher income students, this can be a windfall. You're essentially saying to students who are already receiving full Pell, you can now go to college, which does have some benefits. There are plenty of students who would receive full Pell who don't know that. So there's a real benefit to reducing their financial anxiety because you're telling them something they don't know about their eligibility. But at the same time, for programs that serve all students, this can be a windfall for students whose families are able to pay, which can be expensive. Another thing we found is how you think about the simplicity of the program can have some big costs associated with it. So one example on the front side is thinking about eligibility criteria. If you have really complex eligibility criteria that requires a transcript read, which is a thing some College Promise programs require, you essentially have to hire a staff person to read everyone's transcripts. That's a big expense. And what is it really accomplishing? Well, it's making it more confusing for students. On the other side, some statewide programs, as you may know, have instituted requirements that students must stay in the state for a certain number of years after receiving the program, or it converts from a grant to a loan. Who's going to check that? That's a whole staff person's time to do all that checking, and what are you really accomplishing? That actually brings us into some of the things I want to flag that we don't know, and one is, are beneficiaries staying in the same city, state, or region? If we think about these as economic development programs, is that happening? That'll be really interesting to look at. Are the beneficiaries making family supporting wages? That's our end goal. And then most importantly, in our view, is are these programs being designed to support particular subpopulations of students, particularly low-income students, first-generation students, and even more so now, adult students? Do these students need different kinds of supports, different kinds of structures? Can they go full-time or part-time? Can they go in alternative semesters like summer? Those are all things that we need to be thinking about and really encourage our programs to be collecting data on so that we know whether this is something that is a windfall, is disproportionately serving particular students, is exacerbating achievement gaps, the things that we don't want to see happen. So I will leave it with that. Happy to talk more about this, and I know Tiffany has some great questions to guide us. Thank you.
Yes. So thank you to the panelists for these enlightening presentations. For the sake of time, I won't talk too long. I'll let us jump right into the questions and answers, especially those of you who have questions on your mind. Just want to encourage you one more time to enter them in using the Slido tool, and we're happy to jump in with those questions and prioritize them. But I have some in the event that you don't as well. But I just want to say a couple of things. So I direct the higher education policy work at the Education Trust, and we're a policy and advocacy organization that focuses on creating opportunities for low-income students and students of color all across the educational pipeline, from early education through higher ed. And when I joined the organization back in 2016, we were getting a lot of questions about this free college idea. Is this good? Is it good for equity? Especially because you had presidential candidates running and this was a part of their platforms, and folks wanted to know what to think about it, from the media to, staff who are working with elected officials. And so for us, we wanted to provide, a thoughtful response. Most often it depends, which is well in line with what the panelists shared today. But I do want to make clear our messaging back was always about, we have a big problem in terms of the affordability crisis that will require big solutions, bold solutions. And so we were pleased to see bold solutions like free college, like college promise programs on the table, because it's going to require some big systemic changes to fix the problems that we have in front of us. But the biggest question that remained unanswered for us is, but does this help solve the affordability crisis for the students who struggle the most to pay? And so for us, we took an opportunity to try to apply some of the criteria that the panelists shared today around looking at the design. What does it cover? Who does it cover? Are there some of these criteria that might have a disproportionate impact on low-income students and students of color, like certain GPA requirements, like having to stay in the state and being penalized? And in any case, does it ever turn from a grant into a loan? And that really mattered to us, because what we did see on the bright side, or the potential side with College Promise, is the power of the messaging, the power of being able to tell low-income students that college is an opportunity for them if they're so interested, because we're going to remove the cost barrier for you. And so once you undermine that by converting, from a grant to a loan, you really have created quite a problem for low-income students. And so for those reasons, we started to get more and more involved in the conversation and try to read a lot of the work that these folks are doing, a lot of the folks in the audience are doing as well, to become informed. But again, we're so pleased to see that this idea of doing something big to solve the affordability crisis has momentum, and we think that's really promising. And the best thing that we can do in regards to how it can have a positive impact on equity is try to learn from what's happening already. And I think a lot of the local programs like the panelists discussed today provide us with evidence around what impact is having already on particular students overall, but especially for low-income students and students of color. So with that, I want to open us up with kind of the panelists. You all have taken a look at these programs and their criteria. One kind of research question is, what are the unanswered questions? If you could identify one question that really needs to be answered to help inform the kind of free college promise discussion. And then if there are any barriers to answering those research questions, could you kind of talk about what some of those might be? And feel free to jump in, anyone.
I'll jump in first. All right, so, I think there's a lot of them. I still feel like from a researcher standpoint, this is a very new area to be researching in, even though I think the level and the quality of research is steadily improving. I think we are starting to know a little bit more about kind of the short-term effects of promise programs, right? Is there an immediate effect on college enrollment, or, that eligible high school student and what happens the next year in high school or something like that. But we don't know a lot about the long-term effects. And, to get to that, part of it is frustrating, is just time has to go by and that data has to be collected. But that can't be emphasized enough, the quality of data and the way that these programs are set up to put resources not only to designing these programs, but either having or creating some of the resources to look at these programs to be evaluated and to provide that quality data that so that you can track student level outcomes for a long term, or create the kinds of partnerships between the program and the universities that might be involved, and other city or county players or state players that have access to that sort of data. Those sorts of pieces and partnerships need to connect if we really want to understand, can this improve different outcomes for students for the long haul? So I would say lots of unanswered questions around persistence, completion, the kinds of programs that students are completing. Is this promoting transfer behaviors? We know almost nothing about that, I would say. All those sorts of pipeline questions are one key aspect.
I totally agree. And I would say an important facet of that, as I mentioned earlier, is the subgroup analysis within it. You know, if we're thinking about these as an economic driver and as an equity driver, we need to understand how these programs disproportionately affect or don't affect other people. You know, when I look at Meredith's really important research, I find it really frightening from an equity perspective. And I think a lot more work needs to be done there to think about how we can thoughtfully design programs so that it's not just a windfall for middle and higher income students. It is something that's going to continue to support lower income, historically underrepresented first-gen students of color as well.
I also am curious about like what is happening at the K through 12 level. I think in education, a lot of times we separate like what happens at college compared to what happens at the K through 12 level. And I think we need to understand, especially in school districts where the majority of students are eligible for these promised scholarships, is that really revitalizing those school districts? Like, how are teachers, how are school counselors getting involved? Are they getting involved? I know that there's been some research around this, but not a lot of research. And so I would just be really curious about like, how do we like dig deep, get into like, K through 12 school districts and kind of understand also like, how is the message getting out there? Like, when exactly are they being targeted? We know that targeting students in 12th grade is like too late. And that's where a lot of these programs are targeting students. And so like, how do we set up so that we're targeting students in middle school, and how do we get the families involved, and how do they understand what the promised scholarships are and what the eligibility criteria are? Some of the barriers, I think, is just access to rigorous data. It's, a lot of the work that I did is because of my advisor had access to K through 12 administrative data across the state, and that's really, really rare. There's a lot of states that either don't really have a longitudinal database or that make it really difficult for people to get access to a longitudinal database to do the kind of rigorous evaluation work of these programs. So that's what I would say, just like getting access to like really quality data is difficult to evaluate some of these programs.
Thank you. So the audience wants to talk politics. And a question that has the most votes is around the political side, right? Unfortunately, we don't always make policy just based on what the research says to do. And so folks want to hear more about kind of any work that anyone's doing or research that exists that takes a look at the political side of kind of free college or college promise programs and their popularity, especially those that have very little restrictions in terms of, those that have a more universal design. And is there anyone who could kind of weigh in terms of what you're seeing in the research that exists, or even in some of the tensions between the research that exists on kind of the impact these policies are having and kind of what we're seeing in terms of what has political momentum?
I normally field this question to Martha, who is here. I think when you look at the municipal and state level, there have been bipartisan support. There have certainly been blue and red states who have implemented these kinds of programs. One of the things, if you think from a political standpoint, You can think about Democrats being more likely to support programs that are focused on equity and low-income students. Republicans have been really supportive of workforce-focused promise programs and adult promise programs. I can think, for instance, of the big Indiana programs that are happening right now, which have huge support from Republicans in that state. So I think there's different ways to think about it. They obviously are targeting different groups of students or different types of programs, like workforce programs, based on their political views. But I don't think, strictly speaking, especially at the municipal level, this is exclusively a partisan issue.
I know that some of this work is being done by Elizabeth Bell, who just was a recent Ph.D. graduate, I want to say, of University of Oklahoma, if I'm correct. And now she's going to be a faculty member at Miami. And I know she was looking, I think this was her dissertation work, where she was looking like how do the public support free promise or free college promise programs. And I think it really ranged to depend upon the identity of the particular respondents. I don't want to say anything more than that because I don't remember fully, but I think that is like an area of space that would be interesting for us to kind of do more work around, about how do we speak across the aisle, or how do we get more people interested, excited, and on board with the free college or the promise program movement.
Yeah, and I would echo what everyone is saying. I think the power of these programs is that, in general, it can gain bipartisan support, or there is that evidence. Even at the local level, we're working on understanding program implementation at a few different community colleges across the nation, and these are in very red states and red districts, and in very blue districts, and you see kind of the same passion to support students. I think Lisa's differentiation of, some are focused more on workforce development and some are more on student success or equity. That message is there. I think where the politics come in sometimes are just sort of the values behind why having one of these programs. And so you might see pushback maybe at the state level, where people see college promise programs or the message free college is really just a handout to students, and so you may see people trying to make trade-offs or institute different restrictions or eligibility requirements to say, well, we don't want to just offer this for free. People should have to work for these things. I didn't get free college. I had to work for it all myself. You see that sort of rhetoric, and so I think there's just values and beliefs that are sort of that you can see flow into some of the program decisions and designs. And so that's where, if you have a kind of research-based discussion on what we understand about these programs and who you really want to serve, that can hopefully cut across some of those sort of partisan ideas, because there really is, bipartisan support overall.
So one of the questions we often got, because we came up with criteria of like, well, if you want to positively impact equity, you ought to do free college or your college promise program this way. And we had all sorts of ideas. You need to, include 4 years of college. You should cover, the full cost of attendance for low income students, things like that. And the response we often got was, well, that's a nice idea, but that's very expensive, right? And so there's the funding question. And so the audience definitely wants to talk about that as well. And the bigger question around, like, how are these programs being funded? Is it taxes? Is it state appropriations? Are there examples of, I think Meredith talked about kind of the anonymous donors kind of getting behind the Kalamazoo Promise program, but especially as there's conversation around how do you bring what you see as promising from the local programs to scale, anything that you can offer in the way of funding. What do we know about how these programs are funded, and or any recommendations about how to bring them to scale?
So this also goes into, I think, another researchable question, or something we don't know enough about, is how the implications of different funding models. We know how programs are funded, but certainly not like, is using a local city tax better than, some other sort of public-private partnership. We don't really have answers to those questions, but when you look at the full landscape of programs, and I'll focus kind of on the local programs first, you really see a variety of different creative measures. So the anonymous donor type of funding, that is really, really rare. I would say Kalamazoo is very lucky to be in that situation where there, is a wealthy populace that's willing to kind of bankroll this effort. That's very unique. More often, communities have to be really creative, and they're, trying to get different local foundation or some kind of regional or national foundation dollars. They're connecting that with maybe some other sorts of local types of revenue. Sometimes you see a city tax or a county tax being able to support this work, but it's often many different sorts of funding sources that have to be knit together in really creative ways that maybe will work at the get-go, and you see a lot of programs have a lot of energy up front, and everyone comes to the table because, hey, we like this promise idea, we want to support the community. The question is, will people have that level of energy? Will a foundation keep doling out that seed money that maybe they were really excited about? So it is really, foundations, other public and private sources. A lot of the community colleges, they're relying on the funds that they generate as an institution. So their institutional foundations are really bankrolling these college promise programs. And so, a lot of credit should be given to, I think, a lot of community colleges that are already pretty under-resourced in trying to direct these dollars. And sometimes that is their only level of funding. They may be able to leverage some other sorts of city dollars, but more often than not, it's that institutional foundation raising that money and deciding we're going to put this to student scholarships. That's at least the trend that I'm noticing.
And so we're at time, but before we close, I'm hoping we can just do rapid fire and run down. So if you all, as the experts, had the opportunity to give advice to a policymaker who's interested in designing a college promise program that works well, that is good for equity, what's the one piece of advice you would give them in like a sentence or less, if that's possible?
So my advice would be it's not just a scholarship program, particularly since a lot of these programs, the last dollar, we need to think of what are some other supports that we can couple with the scholarship program that is really going to help students get through college.
Yeah, Meredith stole mine. So supports, right, the panacea, scholarship money is not the panacea. You need to have supports with that. And I think otherwise really ensuring that you're understanding who's being served by the scholarship and doing those sorts of subgroup analyses to make sure your end goal is really what you're targeting. So
I totally agree. And the other thing I would add is really simple eligibility criteria.
Join me in thanking our panel, please.